we're going to go back to our standard UV mapping rather than the triplanar mapping, and we're going to create a displacement shader. And what a displacement shader does is it will move the vertices of an object according to some type of data that we plug into the material. So this is a rocky, bumpy surface, and we would expect the surface not to continue following this perfect spherical shape. We would expect the surface to become broken up a little bit, and we'd expect some unevenness in the silhouette. Now we can do this with a triplanar material, but we'd need to do quite a complicated custom triplanar setup to achieve it. So for the purposes of going through the demonstration, we're going to use a standard shader rather than a triplanar projection shader. And if any of you are interested in more complicated setups, then let me know. We can run an extra session where we will cover those. So this is where we left this material. Now the shader sphere that I have showing is the one with texture islands, separate texture islands for each of these steps. And I mentioned in one of the earlier videos that this might create a problem with some features that we add later on, so we're going to experience those problems now with displacement. So I'm going to go into my basic PBR shader, and to impact or affect the position of 3D data on our mesh, we need to have our outputs go into the vertex part of the shader. And specifically what we want to do is we want to move the vertices, so the vertices that make up the mesh, in a particular direction, so whichever direction they're facing in, according to the data from a height map. So how are we going to do that? Right, so first of all, what we need to do is we need to get the current position of the object. So let's create a new node and we'll call position. So input geometry position is what we're looking for, and this is the position of the object that's being sampled, essentially. So in this case it'll be a vertex. Okay. And we're interested in its position relative to itself. So what is its object position? So what is the position relative to the object? We're currently in a world space on this position node, which is useful in many instances, but in this case we want it to be object space. Okay, next up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a vector 1, and I'm going to call this displacement. And let's pull this out. And what I'm going to do is use a basic maths node which just adds values together. It's the add node. And this is going to add whatever value I have in displacement to the position of the object that's being sampled. Let's output that into the vertex position. So we get the vertex position, and then we add whatever the value is in this vector 1 to the vertex position. And what this does is, because this is a vector 3, so our position is XYZ, right? So there's 3 axes. It's a vector 3. And displacement is only 1. It's only a vector 1. It adds that to each of the 3 values in the vector 3. Okay, so X, Y, and Z will increase according to the value in displacement. I'm going to set the displacement node to be a slider from 0 to 1. Okay, let's save this and go back into the environment. And if I select my PBR shader, you'll see I've now got this displacement slider, and you'll see I can displace. The object is moving when I move this displacement slider. It looks as though we don't have our material on the interior sphere, so let's have that on there. So now they're both going to move. You'll notice that they're moving in different directions, and that is because the sphere that's in here is a child of this object, of its surrounding object. You can see that here, and therefore its axis is probably different, so it's moving in a different direction. And you'll see that they're moving, as I increase displacement, they are moving in 3 axes. They're moving in the X, they're moving in the Z, and they're moving in the Y. Okay, so the whole object is moving. So how do I get it so that the vertices all move according to where they are on the object? Like, essentially we want the object to swell up. How can I achieve that? So to achieve that, what I need to do is I need to find out which direction each of these vertices is pointing in. So let's look for a normal, because each of these vertices has a normal, which is the direction, the vector in which it's facing. So let's have a look for that. I've typed in normal here, input geometry normal vector. That's what we're looking for. And we're interested in the object space vector. Alright, so this is going to give us a direction in which the object is facing, essentially. And I'm going to add a multiply node, which is another maths function. And I'm going to add my displacement to this node. I'm going to plug this into the add. So what we're doing is we are multiplying our displacement by the normal vector, or we're multiplying the normal vector by the displacement. And what that means is it will move in a specific direction, away from the surface, hopefully, if the normals are facing in that direction, which is generally what we would expect from this type of mesh. So there we go. You see, we're going to start getting some issues. We're getting some issues with stretching and all this sort of stuff here, which isn't particularly nice. But we're also experiencing these issues that I mentioned before. Each of these steps, the segments of the steps, is on a separate UV island. And you see how the mesh just kind of separates. Alright, which is not great, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this one off, and I'm going to turn on my smooth UV shader sphere. And this is the one which has got UVs that wrap around, that we might conventionally refer to as being incorrect, right? The UVs are not correct, they're distorted and all this kind of stuff. But when we're working with displacement, you see we don't get the separation here that we had in the previous shader. So even though this is not technically correct, it is correct from a production standpoint, because the mesh is not separating in the viewport. Alright, so we kind of created this sort of rounded effect here, and this is obviously great for stuff like snow and ice and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and we wouldn't normally displace things very much. Okay, so we know that we can displace things in a particular direction now. So what we're going to do now is we're going to get some data in from a height map. We're going to sample it, and then we're going to add a few more little maths functions in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to reposition these so you can kind of see the flow of this a little bit better. So let's add in a new texture 2D, and I'm going to call this height map, like so. And I need to sample this. Okay, and then I'm going to add an extra math function in here. Okay, and multiply these things together. So let's add a multiply here. There we go. And I want to connect this up to this. Okay, so I'm multiplying the data from the texture based on this displacement slider, and I want to add this to my multiply, but I can't. You see, it won't let me connect them up. And this is, I think this is a Unity specific thing in this particular instance, but there are some rules that we have to follow when we're working with vertex displacement, or any type of vertex data. Now, the first rule that we need to follow is there's like an imaginary line between fragment and vertex, or vertex and fragment, and nothing can cross that Rubicon. Okay, so you can't have data that is contributing to the fragment which then goes into the vertex. All right, they're just not compatible. So we can't have things cross this imaginary line from one graph to another. All right, there are some exceptions to that, and I've had it work previously. I've had things work, previously for this, but it's generally if you're experiencing glitches or things won't work, it might be because you're trying to cross this imaginary line, this imaginary sort of data limitation. Okay, but in this case, that isn't the problem. And this is where this becomes like a Unity specific problem. This particular node is not compatible with the vertex shader. So we need to use a different sampler. So let's type in sample, and here you see when we type in sample we get two options, and it's this second one, the LOD sampler, that actually we want. Okay, so this one will give us what we need to be able to connect it up. So you can see now that I've been able to connect that up correctly. Okay, so we are taking our height map data, we're sampling it, and then we're multiplying that by our displacement value. So if the slider's all the way on the left and it's 0, we would expect no displacement. But if it's all the way on the right, then we would expect it to be maximum displacement based on which areas of the height map have the highest value, which is the range between black and white. All right, so white being the highest value. And then that is multiplied along the normal vector to make sure that we are moving things in the right direction. And then that is added to the position of the object. So let's save this and go into our scene. And because we haven't got a height map, it's just kind of like blowing it all out. So let's add our height map into this slot. And we've got a stone H here, which is the height map. So that is now added in. Okay, and what we'll see is you'll start seeing, instead of as I move the displacement, instead of moving everything in all directions, you see we've got an unevenness now to the displacement. Now at the moment this doesn't match up with our color, so let's go into our PBR. Remember, our color is using a unique tiling and offset setting. So ideally what we do is we'd cross this over to here, but this is not going to allow us to connect. Remember, I talked about that Rubicon. We cannot cross the imaginary line. Alright, so what I need to do is set up a different tiling and offset node. Okay, so let's go up here and set up a new tiling and offset node. There we go. Let's minimize this data. Like so. And you'll see I can't even just connect up the tiling value. So I do need to go into here and add an additional tiling function for my height map. There are ways around this, but they just require a little bit more difficulty than what I really want to go into right now. So we're going to just add a separate tiling here. There we go, maximum value 10. Alright, so we've got a separate tiling now for our height map, so let's save this. Go into here, and our tiling, our standard tiling is 2, so we'll set our height map tiling to be 2 as well, so everything should now match up with the features on the color map. And we're just going to modify the displacement a little bit, so we don't necessarily want it to be this extreme. However, having said that, you know, some areas kind of look accurate, but obviously we're getting a lot of swelling and stretching that we don't necessarily want. Alright, now what we can also do is we can manipulate the data that we come up with. Okay, so we could, in our sampler here, after we've sampled the data, we could run this through a contrast node. Alright, we can output that into the multiplication, and what we'll do is we will add a new vector 1 here, and we'll call this height map contrast, and we can have this affect or control the contrast node here. Okay, got a bit of tidying up to do here, but I'll save that for future time. Okay, so we've got our contrast set up here, and I'm just going to set up what is our contrast, and we have this as a slider from 0 to 10, like so. Let's save that out. Okay, so we've got displacement, and we also got contrast, so we can control we've got quite nuanced control over how much displacement we have and which areas of the height map are being used for displacement. Okay, so you can see I've got really subtle control over the displacement by using the height map contrast. All right. Now these things we sometimes can overdo them. You know, early sort of the games of the kind of early HD era, Gears of War, Bioshock, that made tremendous use of things like normal maps and such. They really exaggerated their use of them. Nowadays, if you don't notice it, then I think that's generally a good thing. So if you don't notice it's there and you don't notice it's not there, then that's generally considered to be a good thing. So it's just important to consider, like, why are we displacing something? How much does the surface actually displace in reality, right? So yeah, those are just some considerations to make when you're using this type of effect. All right, so you can see we've broken up the silhouette a little bit. It's displaced according to the detail in the height map, so things aren't all even and such anymore. But you might not necessarily want this. You know, you might want something that's a lot more subtle than this potentially. Okay, again, it's about it being there, but you not noticing that it's there, and not noticing that it's not there either. You can kind of noodle away at this a little bit and see what results you get. Obviously, the higher the tiling value, the less that stretching is going to be an issue. But then you also got to consider, like, how large was the area that was sampled for this particular material. We're also getting some displacement here, which is taking the mesh away from the sphere, which is not necessarily something you'd want. And that's because they're on different UV islands. Okay, looking pretty nice though. Let's have a look at what it looks like in the game view. Let's take a quick bake of the lighting. And this bake will take into account the material displacement. So yeah, again, this just calculates global illumination and all that sort of stuff. So it's far more optimal to do this in engine than relying on the end user's platform. So this is where we get to. So I'm zooming in a bit here, so we're losing a bit of quality, but yeah, this is where we get to in the end, which is quite a nice result, I think. So that is how to create a displacement or vertex displacement within a shader. Remember, key takeaways are, quite often data will not cross this imaginary line here, the Rubicon between vertex and fragment. There are little hacky ways that you can do it, but generally speaking, you need a separate set of data for vertex and than you do for fragment. When you're working in Unity, it does have this weird thing where the standard 2D texture sampler will not work with vertex data, but the LOD texture sampler will. Okay, so that's just something else to bear in mind. Here we're also using some maths functions, so multiply and add. Okay, so we're using controls to adjust things like the scale, if you like, of the sampled data. So obviously if something's multiplied by 0, then its value is 0, but if it's multiplied by 1, then it will be its full value from the sampled data over here. Okay, and we can add these controls at various points in the shader and impact the resultant data that is getting plugged into the vertex position in a variety of different ways.